Thanks very much, Rosie. It's a pleasure to be here at IDS on my first visit, actually, after long following the work of many of your scholars here. As we see IDS as a beacon of creativity and pluralism in the field of development studies. So it's really great to be here. I'm going to just provide a little bit of context for this summary of a think piece, really. One is that it draws on 30 years of work in partnership with public interest groups working in rural Mexico, and so while there are plenty of footnotes and citations of other scholars in the full version, I think you've gotten the link to the paper. What really I'm looking at this literature through this lens of extended practice and partnership with groups working in what is still a highly authoritarian environment in rural Mexico. So that's the first bit of context. The second bit is that I want to say a little bit about the intellectual setting for the invitation to do this think piece, which came from a group embedded in what was then the World Bank Institute, which is now getting morphed into the governance global practice in the context of the World Bank's reorganization. And this Global Partnership for Social Accountability is one of those multi-stakeholder partnerships that really is basically led by the World Bank. They brought in some private foundations and civil society organizations. They have about 200 partner organizations, and they were in their internal debates within the World Bank, in their attempt to persuade the more powerful elements within the organization to take a more partnership-oriented approach to civil society when thinking about accountability, to try to encourage more citizen voice. They found that one of the responses that they got from senior managers who were skeptical of reaching out to civil society was to say, well, isn't the evidence really mixed? And parentheses, doesn't that mean really that we shouldn't do very much or take this very seriously because of these mixed results? And so this notion of mixed results, when in the context of well, we have to have an evidence base, this notion of mixed results ended up having a potentially paralyzing effect, or at least perpetuating an impasse in the internal struggle over whether and how to take a more public-facing partnership approach. So it was in that setting that I was asked to rethink the evidence in order to figure out what does it really mean, what does the evidence really say. So that's the background for this piece. And the working paper has really two parts. The first part I'm going to summarize very quickly, and then I'm going to spend more time on the propositions for discussion that emerge from the review of the evidence. So to say the evidence seems inconclusive doesn't mean there's nothing you can say about it. And I'm really looking here in the literature for cross-cutting lessons, broader patterns that emerge, even though context matters and every place is different, and even though similar initiatives can have different effects in different places, we can still find some broader patterns without going too far in the direction of overgeneralization. Now, the evidence base here, given the kind of debate that my colleagues were engaged in, I decided not to mix up apples and oranges by counterposing large N quantitative studies versus long-term in-depth qualitative institution analyses. Instead, I decided to just look at large N quantitative studies of varying kinds, some RCTs, some not, some based on large real N, like hundreds of municipalities in Brazil doing participatory budgeting and so forth. So that was a deliberate sort of methodological move to try to avoid what I'm calling this apples and oranges problem. So this is basically the takeaway from assessing the evidence. And one of the first interpretive insights was to say that under the umbrella of social accountability and what looks like mixed evidence is really a set of research that is looking at two very different kinds of initiatives. And I tend not to like the word intervention because it has lots of other kinds of baggage, but some of these initiatives certainly are interventions. I wouldn't call participatory budgeting in Brazil a massive national scaled up policy an intervention, right? It's an actual national reform. But that said, the basic proposition here is that one can think of these initiatives in terms of whether they are tactical or strategic. And tactical refers to bounded tools that are strictly information and voice-led, tools that are based on the rather optimistic assumption that simply by providing people with information, the scales will fall from their eyes and they'll discover that through their own power of collective action, they're going to transform themselves, a la Clark Kent becoming Superman, into having the power to transform the behavior of the public sector. In contrast, a strategic approach involves lots of tactics, lots of tools that are articulated into a campaign, not merely an intervention, that include enabling environments for collective action to reduce the perception of risk and threat, to increase the perception that if people were to decide to engage in collective action, they might actually get something out of it. And that also importantly that the citizen voice initiatives are somehow coordinated or articulated with efforts to increase the capacity of, on the government side, to actually respond to citizen voice. Again, to increase to help to unleash virtuous circles where voice leads to some kind of governmental response, which would in turn increase the incentives for more people to exercise voice and unleash a kind of upward spiral of mutually reinforcing interaction. So it's in this context that many of the studies that find very low or no impact of information and voice are studies of what I'm calling tactical approaches, what some colleagues would also prefer to call naive approaches. But I'm trying to be more diplomatic in the paper. So these low impact results include finding that information is not enough, include finding that bottom-up community monitoring often lacks bite and is unable to influence the public sector. And it includes a finding, and this is referring to the Mansouri and Rao piece that you may have seen from the World Bank Localizing Development, which reviews 500 studies to find that induced participation in local development is often captured. Unfortunately for them, they decided for marketing purposes to drop the adjective induced and instead frame their subtitle as "Does Participation Work?" Even though they were only studying induced participation. They say very nice things about organic participation, the kind of real bottom-up participation, but they quickly move into studying induced participation, but by subtitling their book, Does Participation Work?, they immediately alienated all of their potential allies on the pro-participation side, because their answer to the question, again limited to induced participation, is, well, not so much. Not a big surprise to many of us who work on actually existing bottom-up participation. Why would you expect more money being poured through an authoritarian power structure to somehow automatically encourage lots of genuine empowerment? But from the point of view of the World Bank, since lots of their money goes through these channels, this proved to be quite controversial on the inside, and could go into some details about how some very powerful vice presidents who had billions of dollars labeled as community-driven development were made to feel very uncomfortable by a study from the research department that found that much of this money was basically reinforcing authoritarian local elites. So this is one way of turning this reinterpretation of mixed results into the tactical and strategic distinction. So if the tactical approach would suggest that information is power, the strategic approach would limit that, would bound that to say, well, information needs to be perceived as actionable. It needs to be provided or generated in an enabling environment in order to be able to motivate the kind of collective action that is so widely assumed to be associated with the power of information. Similarly, the assumption embedded in lots of decentralized aid programs that decentralization somehow brings the government closer to the people, well, not so much. It really depends on whether that decentralization is democratic. And I did a very detailed study of World Bank funding going to local government social funds in Mexico in the early 90s, and when looking at this in the state of Oaxaca, where already existing local governments were quite accountable and participatory, at least for the male citizens of the community, and in those communities the money really did get out there and reach people and have an enabling effect. But in the neighboring state of Chiapas, where the municipal governments were run by basically local thugs and ranchers, the same money had a quite different impact. And it wasn't a coincidence that in the Chiapas Rebellion of 1994, one of the first targets of the citizens who rose up were the municipal palaces, and they went at them with hammer and tongs, conjuring up images of taking down the Berlin Wall. So the municipal governments were really quite different in different states. So just moving along, that's all just a brief summary of what's in the first half of the paper. What I really want to focus on today are some of the propositions for discussion that emerged from this basic tactical strategic distinction, because my feeling is that we really need a fresh conceptual framework for understanding social accountability. The conceptual frameworks that have been applied to this field are imported from other fields, other intellectual problems, and they've been kind of stitched together, like the principal agent approach or the supply and demand approach, and they really don't sit very well with the kinds of questions that are problem-driven questions that many of us are asking. So I'm going to walk through some of these propositions for discussion. And the first focuses on what kind of information can really be empowering. And here I want to focus on the user-centered idea, and Rosie's been doing some work on this in the context of making all voices count. And my view here was very influenced by the book called Full Disclosure by Fung, Graham, and Weil, where they really emphasize the spelling out of what does user-centered really mean. As user-centered, does it emerge from the imagination of the app developer sitting behind their screen, or does it emerge from actually engaging with the potential users and putting oneself in their shoes in order to figure out what kind of information is meaningful to them, what kind of information actually helps to show the way to possible pathways to change, because lots of information that tells people lots of things are screwed up isn't necessarily news and isn't necessarily empowering unless it actually helps to open doors that show how and why certain kinds of pathways to collective action would actually be able to change their situation. So credible pathways, actionable, transforming data into usable information, those are the keywords that come from this proposition. The next one focuses on voice, and this concept also evolved in dialogue with Rosie, and it really is inspired by a rethink of the enthusiasm around the power of social media and crowdsourced kinds of aggregated voices. And the question really is, yes, aggregation of voices, having lots of individual voices going on at once may be able to influence whether or not certain issues are on the agenda. The question then is, what's next? What happens once an issue is on the agenda? Who gets to have a seat at the table in order to negotiate what is to be done about that issue? That really brings us to the process of representation. Who decides who represents whom? And this is really a sort of old school hearkening back to what in Latin America we have thought of as mass organizations, scaled up membership organizations that have the capacity to with internal democracy, actually deliberate and articulate and represent the interests of large numbers of otherwise excluded people. And in this context, I want to emphasize the role of interlocutors. Many different kinds of actors can play this role. This is a term that is not actually very often defined with precision. There's a certain, you know it when you see it quality to the way the term interlocutors is sometimes used, but I'm defining it in terms of facilitators of two-way communication. If it was just one-way communication, there would be locutors instead of the interlocutors. The third proposition focuses on the power of fear, and again questions many of the assumptions behind the purely information or voice-led approaches that tend to assume that action based on information is essentially costless. or without risk. And here my approach is not only informed by collaboration with public interest groups in places in Mexico like the state of Guerrero, where 43 teacher college students were recently disappeared and have probably been murdered and their bodies burned or otherwise destroyed. But it also was informed by discussions with colleagues, including a recent PhD from IDS, Suchi Pandey, who's been doing research on reprisals against information requesters in India. India, which has one of the best information rights laws in the world, and one of the few that actually has tangible penalties for government non-responsiveness, that has been really widely used and championed. But the little-known part of the story, the dark side of the story, are the number of information requesters who've been assassinated, harassed, threatened, injured, and Suchi's review and these are just the cases that reach the media. So clearly just the tip of the iceberg, but she's found more than 43 information requesters have been assassinated in India for exercising their right to information. And now it's true that they're distributed in an uneven way, primarily around issues of dealing with displacement around extractives and land grabs. Maharashtra is particularly well represented here, unfortunately. And so we have a difference between the kind of zero-sum conflicts and the more, let's say, mundane, everyday service delivery kinds of things that we associate with information requests. Fortunately, none of the information requesters involved with social audits in Andhra Pradesh have been assassinated, because you have reform champions in power in that state who are actively pursuing what I'll come to in a minute, which is their sandwich strategy with an opening from above, coordinating with mobilization from below. So it's an uneven pattern, but what it really points to is, for those who are thinking about encouraging information-led voice strategies, it's really important to think about whistleblower protections of various kinds, and to think about the potential role that anonymity can play in terms of, and actually not only perceived anonymity, but real anonymity. Sometimes it's not perceived, but it's real. Sometimes it's real, but not perceived. But very few people have actually looked hard at the question of the determinants and power of anonymity in terms of exercising the right to know. So the next proposition involves this shorthand of teeth, and in this case, I'm defining teeth in a way that's not completely synonymous with your everyday usage of the term. I'm using it as shorthand for institutional capacity to respond. And responses can involve positive responses, rewarding and supporting those public officials who are listening to the public, and it can include sanctions and as well for those who are abusive and corrupt and not listening. But the basic idea here is to think hard about what's on the other side of voice. What's the flip side of voice? What does voice find when it's exercised? Is voice exercised in a vacuum, in an empty chamber, or is voice projected upwards towards the state and in a way in which it's able to find some capacity to respond? And I stress this because there's so many projects and initiatives around the world that involve investing in beneficiary feedback and all kinds of sort of customer satisfaction types of things that involve trying to induce and collect and crowdsource and stimulate voice where it's not at all clear who's supposed to listen. In other words, whose job is it in the government water agency in city X to respond to the complaints or identification of problems that are being so successfully generated through robocalls or SMS or mobile phones and so forth? Who is supposed to be the authority to take that information and act on it? There are many projects where there's this disconnect, where all of the investment is going on the voice side, and we don't see a counterpart emphasis on the capacity to listen. So the next proposition looks at this notion of low accountability traps. This was developed at the end of my book, Accountability Politics, Power and Voice in Rural Mexico, which looks at the mutually reinforcing nature of a lack of political accountability and a lack of social accountability. In other words, the conventional World Bank World Development Report separation of the long and short routes to accountability from a decade ago implicitly assumed that somehow policymakers and service providers were insulated from electoral politics. That was left to the long route, and somehow those local officials weren't put there by the mayor or the district chief or the governor, who was elected in part thanks to their ability to control social programs and social services and deliver them in a way that involved massive clientelism and conditioning of access based on electoral loyalty and political subordination. So I'm focusing on the mutually reinforcing nature of dysfunctional elections and unaccountable service provision. And by the whole notion of traps is intended to emphasize that these vicious circles are going to be mutually reinforcing in a steady state sort of way, unless some kind of intervention, and here I will use the term intervention, is able to break that vicious circle and somehow create an alternative virtuous circle where the pro-accountability actors are able to reinforce each other mutually and take off from there. So what is the pathway out? That's completely context dependent, but for the sake of parsimony, I'm basically suggesting that the pathways that can crack these low accountability traps, sometimes they can be more voice-led, more bottom-up, more civil society-led. Sometimes they will be more led from the state itself. If a reform champion somehow gets control of a particularly strategic government agency, or if a particularly sort of forward-looking governor gets elected of a particular state, and so forth, as in the case of Andhra Pradesh that I mentioned. And so that's a completely contingent, open question. How will this be triggered? The main analytical proposition here is that these two pathways, these two approaches, rather, voice and teeth, are going to be mutually reinforcing. That if you get progress on the teeth dimension, upwards along the teeth dimension, that in order to keep that moving, there needs to be some voice to push it along. And similarly, if there's progress on the voice dimension, more power exercise from below, that's going to gain more and more power if it somehow finds an echo, a counterpart, a response, or possibly some degree of protection or support from some kind of de facto ally or coalition partner on the institutional side, whether it means triggering the horizontal accountability institutions, the public sector oversight institutions, the audit bureaus, the ombudsman, the other kinds of checks and balance institutions. That's certainly one way. The kinds of checks and balances institutions that are so rarely active unless they are pushed to be active by civil society. And here I'll direct you to the classic early works of Smilovitz and Perasotti on this process in Latin America, where civil society action triggers the enabling and activation of otherwise passive checks and balance institutions. Coming to the end, one of the challenges here in the social accountability field is how to bring in scale. We're talking about a field where the research has tended to be hyper-localized. In other words, the research tends to focus very disproportionately on those social accountability initiatives that are limited to the end of the pipe, the receiving end of governance, the clinic, the school, the municipality, the water system. And by focusing only on the local level, both the social accountability effort and the research is missing much of where the action really is. If there are medicines, if there's stockouts in the clinic, this approach basically assumes, and this approach is embedded deeply in the World Development Report of 2004, this approach assumes that the medicines are not there because the clinic staff must have stolen them. Not because they were stolen halfway up the chain, not because they were stolen all the way up the chain, not because there wasn't any money in the budget in the first place at the national level. It's got to be because the frontline service providers were at fault. That is the assumption of this hyper-localized, bounded approach to social accountability. So this approach essentially assumes that there are many actors involved in the process of corruption and abuse, and that these actors are quite capable of adapting to partial spotlights on their behavior. So if you're really, this is informed by much of the literature on both the social audits in NREGA in India and also the program in Indonesia, the national program, the PNPM, formerly known as KDP, both two of the most ambitious pro-voice, pro-citizen oversight, rural development, anti-poverty programs in the world. Both of them are massive. And both of them have shown great capacity at using these citizen oversight mechanisms to reduce wage theft. Wage theft is an easier target in part because it's relatively obvious compared to other forms of corruption, and you have direct interests involved that can stimulate the action of those who are stolen from, right? And so you have interests and you have capacity to do oversight, but the people doing the stealing are quite capable of saying, okay, keep your wages, we're going to steal the money for materials. That's much harder to monitor. And therefore much easier to get away with. And you hopefully have seen this classic piece by Benjamin Olken on how this works in Indonesia, and it's really, really quite dramatic to see how easy it is for researchers to assume that community oversight is actually able to see problems that are inherently easy to hide. And so you have some confusion in the literature around this. I mean, in terms of stealing materials, the classic method would be to manipulate not the price of the materials, because people can check the receipts. Oh, you're overpaying for the cement. That's easy to monitor. It's not so easy to monitor. Well, you're going to buy the right amount of materials at the right price, and then you're going to build, twice as much road as you should with that materials. It's going to wash away 2 seasons away, but at the time it's not going to be obvious that half of the money was stolen because you were not using enough of the materials. You were doing something else with that money. So essentially the issue of the squeezing the balloon also came from earlier research in the mid-90s on World Bank projects in rural Mexico, where I was involved in citizen monitoring to try to connect the links in the chain of oversight. And one of the classic issues that we found was if we found a problem at the national level, they would say, well, it's really the state government. And if we found the problem was at the state level, well, they'd say the problem is really at the local government. And we found the problem at the local government, well, the problem is really at the state government. And we go back to the state government, well, the problem is really at the national government. And so there's this sort of that's where the idea of, and of course, if you go to the World Bank, they'll say the problem is in the national government. So unless, the proposition here is unless you have the capacity to monitor all links in the chain, you won't know who's lying. Because sometimes it's true. You just don't know when. So this leads to the proposition, and this is a point where I really want to get your feedback because I'm in the process of brainstorming about how to encourage more and better research on this issue of vertical integration. And so the conceptual proposition is that the enemies of accountability are themselves vertically integrated power structures, and that therefore, in order to offset their power, in order to build countervailing power, that it's necessary to also vertically integrate those checks on their power in order to offset the squeezing the balloon. And all of the links in the chain in this proposition need to be covered because the capacity to monitor will only be as strong as the weakest link in this chain. So this brings me to the sandwich strategy, which is the conceptual proposition that emerges from earlier work on a long-standing rural development program in Mexico, rural food stores, that was deliberately designed with this approach in mind, where you heard national managers of this rural development program say to organized rural constituents who had scaled up their own representation, sort of, you squeeze from below and I'll pressure from above. I mean, this was the explicit strategy that involved hundreds of community organizers and thousands of organized villages throughout the country. And this conceptually was inspired by the State Society synergy approach, which is spelled out in a a special issue of World Development from 1996 with Peter Evans and Eleanor Ostrom and others. So this is the conceptual foundation for this idea that first we recognize that the anti-accountability forces are in both state and society, and they have their coalitions. And therefore, the challenge is to form the alternative countervailing coalitions that also can cut across state and society. Now, clearly not all states have potential partners in them, and it's also possible to misperceive who really is a potential accountability partner, because this is not about discourse and ideology. This is about looking at, I'm defining reformers here as state actors who are willing to invest their own political capital in transforming the system, in creating the space for civil society, the enabling environments that reduces the risks inherent in action and increases the likelihood that there will be some kind of response from within. So that narrows the universe quite a bit, to use that more definition of reformer. But so basically this idea of the sandwich strategy is shorthand for these coordinated coalitions among pro-accountability actors, both in state and society. And this approach, unlike many other approaches to social accountability, assumes there will be resistance, assumes there will be conflict. Dialogue with colleagues in some operational NGOs who like to talk about, collaborative approaches and so forth, and they're all fine with the tactical and strategic distinction, and they're all fine with the vertical integration, but they're often working in fairly authoritarian settings where they don't want to openly rock the boat in some ways, and so they like to foreground this collaborative approach. But the proposition here is that whatever you end up calling it for tactical reasons, you need to acknowledge that unless you acknowledge there's going to be resistance and conflict, it's very difficult to take the measures that will be needed in order to actually win those conflicts. So this dynamic is captured in this attempt at a visualization, which is originated as a sandwich and turned into more of a hamburger. But the idea here was to try to take a snapshot of this dynamic of conflict between the pro-accountability coalition that's on the left-hand side, between reformists, those who actually control levers of power within the state, and public interest actors in society, versus the forces of resistance to accountability, who, in the real world, that darker right-hand blob is, of course, much larger than is depicted here, but if it was much larger, it wouldn't have fit into the sandwich very well. It would have been very messy and spilled over, there'd be ketchup everywhere. So I'm also building in the role of media coverage in the center, and I'm in the process of trying to imagine a visualization that will capture the key role of the media, and, which is often treated as a kind of a residual category or something outside the framework, but I would argue that if we're looking at the issue of scale, we're looking at the issue of really changing the balance of power, that it's going to be very difficult to do this quietly behind the scenes, often the provinces where nobody is looking, and that the role of media is really crucial for both activating the checks and balances institutions if and when they exist, and for putting the forces that are against accountability on the defensive, and gradually reducing their capacity to resist. So those are the 9 propositions, and the challenge in this think piece was to figure out a way to sum it up. And so, unlike most academic papers, this one actually has a punchline. So here it is. It's voice needs teeth to have bite, but teeth may not bite without voice. Thank you very much.